1975 saw many sensational events, but none more dramatic than this. Helicopters airlift the last evacuees from the American embassy roof in Saigon only hours before the communist takeover. The climax of the year's biggest story, the end of a 30-year war. The collapse in South Vietnam began in March, when the government ordered a withdrawal from the Central Highlands. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became blind panic as troops fled before the communist armies. In Vietnam's cities, scenes of unbelievable chaos and desperation. Every man for himself, as soldiers and civilians alike fought to get aboard the last ships to leave. One of the ugliest scenes was at Da Nang airport, where South Vietnamese troops pushed women and children aside to claim the last transport plane for themselves. So desperate was the panic that the aircraft took off under fire from those who'd failed to get aboard, and with people still clinging to the wheels. As the flight from Saigon began, red tape was ignored to allow 2,000 war orphans to leave on special mercy flights to America and Europe. But for over 140 children, hopes of a new life were cruelly shattered when their plane crashed soon after takeoff. With total defeat staring him in the face, President Thieu resigned and left the country, bitterly accusing the Americans of abandoning Vietnam. General Minh was sworn in as the South's last president, the only man acceptable to the communists. In the last week of April, the final battle of the war at Newport Bridge on the outskirts of the capital. The Vietnamese suffered heavy casualties, but for a cause already lost. As the battle raged, panic swept Saigon. Hundreds of people tried to claw their way over the wall into the American embassy compound, hoping to be picked up by one of the many helicopters now shuttling back and forth to the American fleet in the South China Sea. On board the ships, the scene was fantastic. Helicopters queued up with light aircraft as Vietnamese pilots used anything that could fly to make their escape from the mainland. Among the refugees, former Vice President Key. To make more room on the flight decks, empty helicopters were pushed over the side, the last crazy expense in a $200 billion war. Back in Saigon, law and order broke down as people with no hope of evacuation consoled themselves with looting American stores. Five hours after the last helicopter had left, the first communist columns entered Saigon, North Vietnamese tanks flying the local Viet Cong flag. They trundled into the grounds of the presidential palace, where General Minh calmly surrendered his country in a simple ceremony. All that day, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, for so long the faceless enemy, marched through the streets of the capital. In the next few days, monuments of the old regime were toppled, and Saigon's markets got a new look. Communist flags and posters of Ho Chi Minh appeared among the vegetables. For Hanoi, it was Uncle Ho's prophecy come true. It was the same story in the rest of Southeast Asia. Cambodia had surrendered 2 weeks earlier. The capital, Phnom Penh, suffered cruelly from bombardment and blockade by the communist Khmer Rouge. The rocket attack on this school in February was typical of many. The capital's agony was expressed in every overcrowded hospital, where the injured found little to heal their wounds and the innocent nothing to assuage their hunger. As in Vietnam, those who conducted the war left before the end. President Lon Nol flew into exile via Thailand. These setbacks were accepted philosophically in America itself, where President Ford's popularity declined in a year that saw the final chapters of the scandal that brought him to office. In January, the courts delivered their verdict on the chief Watergate personalities. John Ehrlichman, guilty of perjury and conspiracy to obstruct justice, was later sentenced to between 20 months and 5 years, as were former Attorney General John Mitchell and Bob Haldeman. Former President Nixon got out and about again after a year of ill health and solitary confinement. In October, he went round in '93 in a Teamsters Union golf match. Back in the White House, his successor faced a host of economic problems and frankly admitted the state of the Union was not good. As recession spread through the industrialized world, dole queues lengthened. In America, there were 8 million unemployed by October. Not only people suffered, cities too. Towards the end of the year, it was clear New York was going bankrupt. The city's bond issues found few buyers, and when Mayor Abraham Beame appealed for federal aid, he was rebuffed, though Washington changed its mind at the 11th hour. For President Ford, the year seemed full of snags. In June, he fell down the plane steps on arriving in Austria. But a whole lot more serious were the 2 attempts to assassinate him. The first occurred on September 5th as the president was walking to the Capitol building in Sacramento, California. A woman in the crowd pulled a gun, but before she could fire it, it was wrenched from her hand by a Secret Service agent. The president, visibly shaken, was rushed into the nearby building as his assailant was identified as 26-year-old Lynette Fromm. The second attack came 2 weeks later in San Francisco. As President Ford approached his limousine, a shot rang out. He was bundled into the car and driven off at high speed to the airport. Again, his attacker was a woman. The president was undeterred. 2 weeks later, he was campaigning from an open car as he took the first steps towards securing the Republican nomination for next year's elections. And in October, he astounded friends and critics alike by making sweeping changes in his cabinet. In a move dubbed the Sunday Massacre, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was replaced by Donald Rumsfeld, a State Department aide and protege of Henry Kissinger. Elliot Richardson was recalled from London to be Secretary of Commerce, though many tipped him as a vice presidential candidate following Nelson Rockefeller's announcement that he wouldn't be running on the Ford ticket next year. Rockefeller had just chaired an inquiry into the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency, whose revelations had shocked the nation. In its wake, the president appointed a new chief for the agency, George Bush, a former envoy in Peking, who'd little experience of security affairs. In all these moves, the pundits saw an attempt to capture the right wing of the Republican Party from California's Ronald Reagan, who announced his own presidential ambitions in November. The year brought some hopeful developments in East-West relations. 35 nations met in Helsinki for the final stage of the European Security Conference. The delegates signed a 30,000-word document, the most comprehensive declaration of political principles ever drawn up. For Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, it was the end of 3 years' diplomatic effort to secure formal recognition of Europe's present frontiers. Détente on Earth was matched by détente in space. In July, a Soviet Soyuz and an American Apollo were launched within hours of each other and came together for a joint mission 140 miles above the Earth. The 3 Americans and 2 Russians had spent months preparing for the trip and now shared true friendships as well as their packed dinners.
They made a little joke and had a different label on the other side of it.
Meanwhile, events in Portugal were making headlines in Europe. Rallies and demonstrations were almost daily events as the revolution swung wildly between right and left. The first crisis came in March, when paratroopers tried to stage a right-wing coup. Confusion reigned for 24 hours until loyal units regained control. Who organized the coup was never clearly established, but the government blamed Antonio de Spinola, the general who'd set the revolution going last year. The former president fled to Brazil. In April, Lisbon was awash in a sea of political slogans, as no fewer than 12 parties contested elections for a constituent assembly, the first free elections in 40 years. The communists, led by Álvaro Cunhal, had often been the most vocal on the streets, but their electoral appeal proved more limited. They gained less than 13% of the vote. The moderate Popular Democrats got 26%, but it was the socialists under Mário Soares who topped the poll with nearly 38%. Their joy was short-lived. Within weeks, Soares was in headlong conflict with the Prime Minister, Vasco Gonçalves. A severe, unbending communist, Gonçalves tried to push the revolution sharply leftwards, irrespective of popular support shown for the political parties, and he clashed with moderate elements in both army and government. In May, the socialist paper Republica was taken over by its communist workers. Crowds demonstrated to persuade the government to restore the paper to its socialist director. Instead, Premier Gonçalves closed it down altogether, and the socialists and Popular Democrats left the government. But outside Lisbon, opposition to the communists was growing. In the towns of the north, rallies turned to riots. Offices of the Communist Party and its allies were stormed and ransacked. This was Famalicão on August 5th. A week later, in Braga, the mood was even uglier. The placard showed the sentiment wasn't just anti-communist, but anti-government and anti-army. The result of all this was the resignation of Gonçalves in September. The new Prime Minister was Admiral Pinheiro de Azevedo, whose main aim was to unite the country again. He began by inviting the civilian parties back into the government, with ministries divided between them according to their electoral strength. A setback for the communists, but a move that eased tension and quelled the riots in the north. But divisions in the army continued, and there was open mutiny among some units. The Premier himself admitted his government lacked total support and was unable to impose its control even in some parts of Lisbon. As the year ended and the power struggle continued, few were prepared to forecast where the Portuguese Revolution or its present leaders would be in 12 months' time. In neighbouring Spain, the 36-year rule of General Franco came to an end with the Caudillo's death in November. The last months of his regime saw mounting violence as urban guerrillas fought political repression with terror tactics. Many Spaniards accepted that Franco, at 82, had outlived his usefulness to the nation. But when he finally died, after a long and painful illness, there was a genuinely sympathetic response. Thousands flocked to his lying in state. He was buried with full military honors at the Valley of the Fallen near Madrid, a memorial he himself had built to honor his Civil War dead. Spain's new head of state was not a general, but a king, Juan Carlos I, the man Franco had trained since boyhood for this very moment. The new monarch appealed for unity by hinting at greater political freedoms. Even as Franco lay on his deathbed, Juan Carlos had met his first challenge in the sandy wastes of North Africa. In November, Morocco's King Hassan called for a march of liberation to claim Spanish Sahara, following the rejection of his case by the World Court. 100,000 volunteers were asked for, but over 3 times as many set out on the road south in the biggest nationalistic jamboree North Africa had ever seen. Across the border, Spanish troops and armor stood ready, and the colony's governor said his men would shoot. But before the marchers reached the minefields, diplomacy prevailed and the Moroccans returned home. In the Middle East, the year brought hope and despair in fairly equal measure. Another Israeli withdrawal here in Sinai was the chief talking point, and American Secretary of State Henry Kissinger embarked on 2 rounds of shuttle diplomacy to negotiate the terms. In March, he found the Israelis unwilling to yield and returned to Washington empty-handed. But Egypt's President Sadat insisted Israeli concessions were needed to avoid another war. 5 months' pressure from Washington finally paid dividends in September, when the Israelis signed an agreement that put the Sinai passes under United Nations control, with early warning stations manned by American technicians. The Israelis also handed back to Egypt the oil fields in the south at Abu Rudais and Ras Sudar. 2 days after the Israelis had left, the Egyptians arrived and took over the installations in a ceremony which seemed designed to check if the Israelis had in fact left the oil under the sand. 3 months earlier, Egypt had eased tensions in the area by reopening the Suez Canal to international shipping, including cargoes bound for Israel. President Sadat led a flotilla of warships through the restored waterway in a ceremony of great national rejoicing. Elsewhere in the Middle East, things were much less peaceful. This was typical of many days in Beirut, as Lebanon erupted in religious and political strife, which at its worst assumed the proportions of a full-scale civil war. The conflict was basically between right-wing Christians called phalangists and poorer left-wing Muslims, whose demands for a bigger share of power triggered the crisis. Over 4,000 people died in the murderous shootouts in the streets, with many more injured and maimed. The devastation, too, was appalling. At times, whole streets blazed unchecked in the center of the capital. Cost of the damage, nearly $1 billion. Trying to bring order out of chaos was Rashid Karami, Lebanon's prime minister. But finding a formula for a lasting ceasefire was beyond him or his government. He formed a council for national reconciliation, which included politicians from all parties. But nothing they or religious leaders suggested had much influence on events in the streets. The only hopeful sign came from a spontaneous demonstration by Christians and Muslims who staged a peace march through Beirut at the end of October. The Arab world was also rocked by the death of Saudi Arabia's King Faisal, shot dead in his palace in March by a nephew. The slain monarch was buried, according to Muslim rites, in an unmarked grave after a service attended by many leaders of the Arab and non-Arab world. The new king, Faisal's half-brother Khaled, pledged himself to continue the policies of his predecessor. 1975 was also a year of terrorism. Kidnappings became commonplace. One of the most dramatic was at this house in Ireland, where two provisional IRA members held Dutch industrialist Tida Herema hostage for 17 days, while troops and police kept a patient vigil outside. When Mr. Herema was released unharmed, his captors gave him a bullet, which they said was the one they'd intended to kill him with.
And did they threaten to kill you in the house?
North of the border, the year brought little joy for the 17,000 British troops in Northern Ireland. No political solutions emerged, and there was no end to sectarian violence. Riots in August were only the mildest form of protest. Scores of bombing incidents punctuated the year. This was one of the worst when a bar in Belfast was blown up in April. 6 people died. The bombers were also busy in England. Bars, restaurants and the cars of British members of Parliament were attacked. In all, 8 people were killed. In Argentina, too, urban terrorism reached a new peak. Hardly a day passed without some outrage as left-wing guerrillas continued their battle to bring down the government of President Isabella Perón. There were many who believed Mrs. Perón wouldn't last the year, surrounded as she was by so many conflicting factions. But she proved more than just a figurehead for her husband's movement and seemed to generate her own genuine popular support. But despite the ovations, she found no solutions to the country's chronic problems. In July, a general strike brought Argentina to a standstill as the unions protested the withdrawal of a 100% wage award. They argued, successfully, that the money was needed to keep up with the country's rocketing inflation. Many goods quadrupled in price during the year, and long queues formed outside shops as housewives tried to hoard for the future. Political murders increased. Incredibly, over 700 people were assassinated as right fought left. The army spent most of its time hunting down guerrillas. Any they found were dealt with drastically. These 3 were killed in a shootout in Cordoba. In September, the pressures of office forced Mrs. Perón to retire temporarily for a complete rest. The acting president was Italo Luda, the Senate chairman. In the uncertain political climate, some people thought he might be confirmed in office. But after 4 weeks at a country retreat, Mrs. Perón returned. And as the year ended, her position seemed more secure than at any time since she took over from her husband 18 months ago. Half a world away, another woman leader had her problems. Indian Premier Indira Gandhi faced a constitutional crisis in July when the courts found her guilty of election offences. Throughout Delhi, opposition groups took up the issue of government corruption with many demonstrations against the Prime Minister. Mrs. Gandhi's reply was to declare a state of emergency, curb the press, imprison political opponents and appeal directly to the masses. In Africa, the most important developments occurred south of the Zambezi. South Africa's Premier, John Vorster, was the moving force behind attempts to settle the Rhodesian issue once and for all. He and Zambia's President, Kenneth Kaunda, held the ring for a unique conference in August. In a railway carriage on a bridge above the Victoria Falls, Rhodesian Premier Ian Smith met face-to-face with his African opponents. The conference broke up in disagreement, and in the following months, the Africans split, leaving Joshua Nkomo as the man Smith may ultimately have to deal with.
And with that unity, we face our constitutional problem.
Vorster's initiative to settle the Rhodesian affair was prompted by rapid political changes on Rhodesia's borders. Samora Machel, one-time guerrilla leader, became president of Mozambique when the country achieved independence in June. Independence too for Portugal's other colony, Angola. The Portuguese pulled out, leaving three rival nationalist groups struggling for power. The MPLA Marxists received aid from Moscow. Their leader, Agostinho Neto, proclaimed this group the rightful government, even though it controlled less than a third of the country. In the north, the Angolan National Liberation Front of Holden Roberto was supported by Zaire and allied itself with the strongest group of all, UNITA in the south. UNITA raised its own flag 300 miles from Luanda. Its leader was Jonas Savimbi, a fierce anti-communist, and his forces made steady inroads into MPLA territory. Reports mentioned South African soldiers fighting on Savimbi's side. At the year's end, the stage seemed set for a bitter civil war. "1975 was also the year the Third World struck a blow for its own people. At a special UN conference, the undeveloped nations called for a new economic order, a fairer distribution of wealth.
Considered by the international community for many years.
We are here, well provided, well fed. We have sinecure jobs, but what about the people of the world?
The oil producers raised the price of their commodity by 10% in September, so placing an even bigger strain on the already overburdened economies of the industrial nations. Near Paris in November, the leaders of the United States, Japan, and the four biggest members of the European community found broad agreement on ways to lift themselves out of recession. It was an encouraging note on which to end the year. Finally, some happy moments for dog lovers in the craziest auditions of the year. A veritable canine cantata with some remarkable solos. But for sheer lung power, a maverick entrant was unequalled. Well, it's nice to find someone at least for whom 1975 was a howling success.
And